Hi, this is Christina Singh, and I'm the founder of the Right News Channel, and this is episode 2 of the Right News. This episode is going to look at the whole area of vaccination certificates and passports. This is an area that's being looked at seriously by many governments worldwide at the moment. And so I want to look today at what actually are vaccination passports or certificates. Number two, which countries are rolling them out and have they been efficient? Number three, what are some of the objections that have been raised concerning this whole area of vaccination passports and certificates? So let's quickly look at what are vaccination passports or certificates. So the whole idea of vaccination certificates are not new. In fact, in the early 1960s and 70s, WHO issued certificates of vaccination for proof against inoculations for typhoid, um, yellow fever, and of course, smallpox. So that was the main intention to allow people to travel if and when they have been inoculated against the smallpox disease. So by the 1980s, early 1980s, this was certificate was not necessary anymore because smallpox and those highly infectious diseases were completely eradicated. Now, whether that was because of the vaccine or whether it was just better hygiene standards and better nutrition, that remains debatable. But in any case, so the vaccination certificates or passports for travel between countries for COVID 19 has been debated or has been rolled out because obviously countries want their citizens to be able to freely access public amenities and facilities such as gymnasiums, health clubs, cafes, restaurants, theaters, and so on and so forth. And of course, to be able to travel internationally cross borders. So, what are some of the countries that have actually started rolling them out? Well, China, for one. So, 5 million of China's citizens have already been vaccinated, and they have their own equivalent of the vaccination certificate or passport, which is a QR code that is scanned onto a smartphone and it is run across a platform called WeChat. So, we have no evidence as to whether or not this has been successful. The number two country which has been rolling out its own version of something called the Green Pass is Israel. So Israel is one of the most highly vaccinated countries in terms of the COVID. And this is because of its 9 million population, half have already had double doses of the vaccines. And so in Israel, they have now got something called the Green Pass, which allows their citizens to freely access public places and travel. Now, whether or not they can travel internationally is, of course, dependent on whether or not other countries are going to be allowing Israelites to be freely traveling based on their green pass. Now, what are some of the flaws that have already been experienced in Israel? Now, one of the main areas of concern is that citizens who actually are not privately health insured, they actually do not have access to the Green Pass, which means then there is inequitable distribution of or access to public places. Because if you are not health insured, then you have no Green Pass, which means that you still cannot access those public facilities. So that's one serious flaw. The other flaw has been that really the country has not been able to see their police being deployed in sufficient numbers so that they can actually stand at entrances of these public facilities to check that people have got their green passes in place. So that's another major consideration for countries that are considering rolling out these vaccination passports and or certificates. Now, the EU in particular is looking at rolling out their version of the green certificate by summer. So, what are some of the points to consider as countries such as the EU? And of course, we have Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong looking at something similar as well. So, let's look at some of the considerations that have been voiced by many parties as to whether or not something like that is actually efficient. Now, the first agency that I want to quote is WHO itself. And so this is actually very interesting because Mike Ryan, who's the executive director of WHO's health emergency programs, has actually come out to say that, and I quote, we are lacking critical evidence regarding whether or not these persons who were vaccinated continue to be affected or continue to transmit disease. So if that's in question, then that takes the whole point of a vaccination certificate or passport to be really a piece of nonsense, really. And in fact, WHO has publicly come out to say that authorities should not require proof of COVID-19 vaccinations for international travel as a condition for departure or entry. So there you have it. That's the WHO saying that authorities should not require proof of COVID-19 vaccination for international travel. And I don't think you have an agency that's higher in the land to be saying something like that. But still, of course, you have lobby groups such as the International Air Travel Agency, which represents 290 members of its airlines, saying that, of course, they want to push for this. Well, of course, we can understand why, because the more planes you have on the ground, the poorer your company is going to be. And but I understand as well, business people do want to be able to travel freely again so that they can get business on the move. And of course, there are families who have not seen each other for more than a year since COVID was declared in March of last year. And these people, of course, want to be able to freely travel. And of course, there are travel bugs as well, travel enthusiasts who just simply want to travel for the sake of traveling. So once again, we have to ask ourselves the question, why is such a certificate or passport actually even necessary if WHO is saying that it should not be necessary? So what are some of the objections that have been raised? And one area of concern is in the whole area of technology. So I'm going to quote now someone by the name of Andrew Budd, and he's actually the CEO of a company called iProve, which uses biometrics in the whole area of ascertaining that a certificate can be in place. So what the company does is that it scans travelers' facial features and creates a biometric that is then linked on cloud to their vaccination status. And I'm going to quote Andrew Butt now. He says, this is going to be extremely complicated. Ideally, you would want one international standard for the issuance, verification, and transportability in recognition of a single certification worldwide. So there you have it. A technology person saying that this is going to be extremely complicated. And then, of course, that's the whole area of the ethics of allowing our health data, which is some of our most important data, to be accessible to all and sundry. So I have the director of strategy at Privacy International, Alexandrian Pelodicovian, and I quote her. She says, "It is unlikely to be confined to travel alone. It is actually going to be to infiltrate areas of our lives where we've never had to show identification to go to work or to go to a public space, for example, a park. And that data collected may be used for law enforcement." So there you have it. Someone in the whole area of privacy saying that this use of our data may actually be misused or abused. There's also the whole area of equity. So some countries or lobby groups are saying that you're actually going to be creating a greater divide between developed countries where vaccines are freely accessible or that they are going to be rolling them out, and countries where vaccination is going to be taking a few years in order to be in place. So the gap that exists between developed nations and third world countries is actually going to widen. So my challenge is then to governments that are considering the rollout of vaccination passports and certificates. Number one, have you really considered the technology aspects? Number two, are you looking at the ethical aspects of such a passport being issued or certificate being issued, that it's actually going to be detrimental to privacy of individuals? And number three, are you not creating then more inequity between the developed and the not so developed countries? So there you have it, folks. I, for one, certainly would not want to have to be issued a vaccination certificate or a certificate or a passport. And number two, of course, I'm actually questioning this whole area of vaccination, whether or not it is efficient and whether or not I need to be vaccinated. So that's my personal opinion. Of course, you're entitled to yours. I hope that you found this episode of the Right News informative and useful. And if you think that it was, please do go ahead and share it and like it. And the more shares that I have, the less likely that I'm going to be closed down. But the Right News actually hopes to be able to show an objective view of any issue that we discuss. And I understand that we want to have more visuals in place. I am working on that, folks. And bear with me while I explore that whole area of creating more visuals. But I'm going to try and make this more exciting by having interviews in my next few episodes. So stay tuned to the Right News channel.